Hi guys. The post we did yesterday created a bit of confusion. Not because of what the post was about, but purely because people couldn't understand how can a client start trying to make a vodka and end up making a whiskey. Now I thought I'd give some clarity on this by looking at South African liquor law. Now please note we're looking at South African liquor law here. Different laws, different countries, different product classifications. For instance, in Central Africa, you can take a vodka, add a whiskey essence, and you can sell it as a whiskey. Legally, it's allowed. However, in South Africa, different rules, different requirements. Ireland, different rules, different requirements. Same with Scotland, America. All countries have their own classification methodology and their own way to define how a product can be made. So we're going to look here at South African liquor law, what we call the South African National Liquor Products Act, specifically the South African National Liquor Products Act regulations. That defines what we're allowed to do and how we're allowed to do it. So if we look at malt whiskey in South Africa has to be produced by a mash of malt. It doesn't say what type of malt, doesn't say barley, maize, any type of malt or combinations of malt can be used to make malt whiskey, in which the diastase contained therein with or without other natural enzymes has brought about the sugar conversion. I have to use the carbohydrates that I get from the grain and convert that into sugar. I'm not allowed to add additional sugar or add anything else to increase my yield. I'm only allowed to use the natural carbohydrates converted to sugar, which ferments to alcohol. That fermentation has to be done by the activity of yeast exclusively, nothing else can be used. And it must be distilled in a pot still so that the distillate has the flavor and the taste originating from the raw material used. Now note two things in here. Firstly, pot still. Technically speaking, there are 6 different types of stills in the world. There's pot stills, alembic stills, adjustable reflux column stills, fractionating reflux column stills, multi-column stills, and continuous stills. In South African law, however, there's only 2 types of stills, pot stills and continuous still. Now, continuous still runs 24 hours a day, 360 days per year, continuously taking fermentation and turning that into alcohol. A pot still, however, the legal definition of a pot still is a batch operated still, meaning I fill it, I do a run, I empty it. I fill it, I do a run, I empty it. So pot still refers to a batch operated still, and a malt whiskey must be made in a batch operated still. Secondly, the distillate must have the flavor and taste originating from the raw material used. You need to taste the maize, you need to taste the rye, you need to taste the barley depending on what you use to make this product. It does not specify at what percentage you need to distill it. Some countries have a distillation requirement. If that product has to be distilled between 70 and 80%, must be distilled between 80 and 85%. Depending on which country you're in. In South Africa, however, there is no distillation percentage requirement. It has to just taste like the raw material, then it is classified as a whiskey. It must be matured for at least 3 years in a wooden cask with a capacity not more than 700 litres. 3 things to note in here. Firstly, 3 years. In South Africa, all types of whiskey must be aged for a minimum of 3 years. Unlike America, where straight bourbon and straight whiskey must be aged for a minimum of 2 years, all other whiskies and bourbons, there are no aging requirements. It must just go into a new American oak barrel, whether that's a couple of minutes, a couple of days, a couple of weeks, a couple of months, a couple of years, it doesn't matter. That's a choice for the producer. But in South Africa, it must be for 3 years in a wooden cask. Secondly, a wooden cask. Doesn't specify the type of wood. In South Africa, brandy has to be in an oak barrel. Doesn't specify French oak or American oak, but it must be an oak barrel. Whiskey, however, just a wooden barrel. It can be any type of wood, does not necessarily have to be oak. And must not have a capacity of more than 700 litres. You can use a larger barrel, you cannot use a larger barrel, but you can use a smaller barrel. Now, the challenge comes in here. If my barrel is too small, 25 litre, 50 litre barrel, which is commonly used in countries where rapid aging is allowed, then you can age very quickly. But if I use that 25 or 50 litre barrel for a period of 3 years, which I have to do in South Africa, there's a fairly good chance the product is going to be overwooded. So the standard is to use bigger barrels, 350 to 700 litre barrels for the 3-year period. And then lastly, the content must be at 43%, the final product, a minimum of 43%. Please note that it is allowed to be higher, so overproof spirits, 50-55%, completely legal, but it may not be lower than 43%. That is also unique to South Africa. Other countries normally 38 to 40%. South Africa higher at 43% minimum. Also, malt whiskey produced in the Republic shall be matured in a Customs and Excise warehouse in wooden casket, approved for its purpose by the Commissioner of Customs and Excise. So in South Africa, all barrels used for whiskey has to be approved by Customs and Excise, and they're actually required to be there when you fill your barrels. This is unique to whiskey, not required for brandy, for instance. So that is malt whiskey, pot distilled, and you must be able to taste the flavor and aroma of the raw material. If we look at whiskey in South Africa, whiskey shall be produced from a mash of grain, does not require malt, just grain, in which the diastase contained within before other natural enzymes brought about the sugar conversion. Again, not allowed to add anything to increase yield, only allowed to use the natural carbohydrates that have been converted to fermentable sugars. It must be fermented by the activity of yeast, and it can be distilled at less than 94.8% by alcohol by volume, so that the distillate has a flavor and taste originating from the raw material used. Now, that's kind of a ridiculous statement, because I can tell you at 94.8%, any grain fermentation has long since lost all its flavor and taste. That, my personal opinion, is there so that you can make whiskey in South Africa using continuous stills. But still, you are required to still retain some flavor of the raw material. Whether that's possible at 94.8%, well, I leave that for you to decide. Because the higher the percentage alcohol, the less the flavor content. It must be matured for at least 3 years in wooden cask with a capacity of not more than 700 litres, exactly the same as with a malt whiskey. Must have alcohol content of at least 43%. And then finally, the whiskey must also be aged and matured under excise supervision in approved barrels. And again, they need to be there when the barrels get filled. So, whiskey allows the use of continuous distillation. 94.8% does not require to be batch distilled as with malt whiskey. If we look at blended whiskey consists of a mixture of at least 25% calculated on the basis of absolute alcohol of malt whiskey and not more than 75% calculated on the basis of absolute alcohol of whiskey. Now, what does that mean? In a 750ml bottle at 43%, there is 322 milliliters of absolute alcohol. Of that 322 milliliters, 25% at least has to be batch distilled. 75% at most may come from a continuous still, and that put together, that blended together, creates blended whiskey. Now, if we look at vodka, vodka shall be produced by the distillation of any fermented, undiluted, harmless vegetable article, or any fermented with water diluted harmless vegetable article in a fractionating or rectifying column. So, we want high purity. That's the implication by specifying that we have to use a rectifying, fractionating, a reflux column. We want high purity, and as I said, the higher the purity, the less the flavor. Which brings us to point B. It may not have any distinctive characteristic, aroma, taste, or color. Again, it's not specified at what percentage do I need to distill my vodka. In America, for instance, there's a requirement that vodka must be distilled at 95% ABV. In South Africa, there's no such legal requirement. As long as there is no flavor or taste in the vodka, it is classifiable as a vodka and must also be at 43% minimum alcohol percentage. Looking at grain spirit. Now, grain spirit would be a moonshine, an unaged vodka. It's an unaged whiskey. It's not a vodka because you can taste the raw material, you can taste the grain, so it's therefore not a vodka, but it wasn't in a barrel, therefore it's not a whiskey. So what is it? It falls under what we call unspecified spirits. Now, unspecified spirits is a general category for any product, alcohol product made that does not fall into a legitimate category. So, unspecified spirits shall be produced by the distillation of any fermented, undiluted, harmless vegetable article or any fermented with water diluted harmless vegetable article except the fermented product of the vine. We're not allowed to use grapes in an unspecified spirit. Secondly, it may not be a spirit of any other class specified in the Act. So, if it falls under whiskey, if it falls under vodka, if it falls under cane, you can't call it an unspecified spirit. It must be something that is not classifiable in an existing category. It must have an alcohol content of at least 43% and may not contain more than 10 grams of methanol per liter of absolute alcohol if fruit is used. If it's a grain-based product, you have to comply to the legal maximums tolerances that is specified in the law. Now, an unspecified spirit, putting that on a label kind of sounds weird. So luckily the law allows us to substitute the word unspecified for the raw material used. So if I'm making a mango mampu, for our international followers, that would be an unaged fruit brandy made from mango. We just call it mampu in South Africa. So if I'm making a mango mampu, I would be classified as an unspecified spirit, but on a label I can say mango spirit. In the case of grain, my classification is unspecified spirit, but I'm put on the label grain spirit. That would be a moonshine, for instance. If I want to commercially sell moonshine in South Africa, I fall under grain spirit. If I take gin as an example, the requirements for gin says that gin shall be distilled or produced by the distillation of the fermented mash of grain together with juniper berries, irrespective of whether common salt or almonds, aromatic plants or seeds have been added thereto. So if I use grain, distill it through juniper, I've made gin. Or the redistillation of any other class of spirit with juniper berries, irrespective of whether common salt or almonds, aromatic plants or seeds have been added thereto. So I can use any spirit, not just grain spirit. Any spirit can be used to produce gin. I can also do the third option here, the add mixing of the distillate referred to in subparagraph 2 and any other classes of spirit. So I can make a gin base, a gin concentrate, and mix that with vodka or anything else to increase my yield. That is also allowed. Number B, point B, is a new one. As of March this year, point B was included. And what point B says is, it must have the distinctive taste and aroma characteristics of gin and be clearly distinguishable from any other class of spirit. Now, prior to March this year, if you distilled through juniper, you could call it gin. Whether or not you could taste the juniper, which is the distinctive characteristic of gin, that didn't matter. As long as it was distilled through juniper, you could call it gin. After March this year, you must now be able to detect the juniper, otherwise your product is not a gin. Now that came into being because as of March this year, we are allowed to do barrel-aged gin in South Africa. Prior to March this year, that product was illegal, but now we are allowed to do it. And because we are now allowed to do barrel-aged gin, they've now changed the requirement that the juniper must be detectable in the gin. And then finally, it must have an alcohol content of at least 43%. So why did I show you all these products? I mean, we're talking about whiskey and vodka, aren't we? Why gin? Where does this come into being? Because when I use grain as my base, I can do a lot of different things with that grain. Let's take a look at a couple of things. What can I make from grain?